الساحة الدولية بتلعب دور في إنه مثلا
So yes, there is much to celebrate. Sight, of course, is lost on the fact that it wasn't simply the celebrated amnesty process, and it wasn't simply the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with its hearings that delivered this democracy. It really was part of a larger package of instruments and tools. And here I talk about the long and torturous and painstaking and, dare I say, painful road that we had to negotiate from the moment of Mandela's release at the end of the 1980s, or rather the beginning of 1990 to be precise. Then he painted a picture of what was taking place in South Africa at the end of the 1980s. Much of South Africa was something of a battleground. There were sites of conflict all over the place. Many of the black townships had become ungovernable. In fact, the security forces really couldn't enter those parts of the country unless they were in tanks or on vehicles. It was just to say that part of the country was being run by local committees, various organizations, and of course the National Congress, and it's an ongoing wing on the ground at the time. Having said that, the South African military was still pretty impressive, and there was simply no way that there was resistance on the ground. With the civic movements, the youth organizations, and of course the armed wing of the African National Congress, called Contempt of Sizwe, translated as the Spear of the Nation, as affected their war with strategic bombings and assassinations. There was simply no match to the South African military machine. At that point in time, it probably was the most powerful military machine or institution on the continent of Africa. It possessed a mighty air force and even nuclear capabilities as well. So there was no defeating the South African state. So it was true to say that at the end of the 80s and early 1990, we were in a classic stalemate. South Africa was a pariah state. Virtually no country in the world outside of countries like Israel and Paraguay and Taiwan was really serious business with South Africa. There was boycotts, cultural, sporting, and economic. It was true to say that, at least at an economic level, and let's face it, it's economic which really hurts. The country was on its knees, it had spiraling debt, and lines of credit were being cut off all over the place, and we were in a serious state of affairs. And it's largely because of those reasons that the negotiations were able to take off. Yes, indeed, much credit must be given to the wisdom and foresight of Nelson Mandela, and also, I must say, rather grudgingly, F.W. de Klerk as well, for taking those steps. But it wasn't as if F.W. de Klerk saw the light and decided that racism was something that he disagreed with and he wanted to turn over a new leaf. The fact is that he was forced to. He was a pragmatist. F.W. de Klerk had to come up with a process going forward that would on the one hand offer a stake in the political process to those excluded, but on the other hand would protect the political and most importantly the economic interests of his constituency, which was most of the white people in South Africa. And you've got to hand it to him, that's precisely what he did, and he did so rather successfully. white people today enjoy amongst the highest standard of living in the world, even though much of the country is in a state of deprivation, and many black people remain unemployed and poverty-stricken. Let's return to the negotiation process. I spoke about this larger package, and I think it's important to highlight a few of the mechanisms that we set up. There were multi-party talks, and those talks went on for a couple of years. I noticed in Egypt, I don't want to do too many contrasts, but if I can make one observation, people in Egypt seem to be in quite undue haste, quite a rush to get things done, finalize agreements, get a constitution sorted and implemented. One can understand why that people are impatient. If we look at South Africa, and I suspect South Africans are equally impatient people. If we had to mark a beginning of our transition, it would certainly be the 2nd of February, which marked the unbanning of the ANC and the other prohibited organizations, and the subsequent release of Nelson Mandela. The negotiations began a few months later in that year, and really didn't conclude until the end of 1993. So when you count up those weeks and months, that's nearly 4 years of painstaking negotiation. I should tell you that the years of our transition, the years between 1990 and 1994, I'm not suggesting that our transition ended in 1994, by the way. 1994 was the year we held our first democratic elections. But that short period of time, some 4.5 years, marks the most violent and most brutal period of South Africa's modern history. I was involved in human rights monitoring at the time with different legal organizations and monitoring outfits. And we estimate that roughly between 3,000 and 4,000 people are dying each year through ongoing political violence, and drive-by shootings, massacres, clubbings, knives, etc. And here we're not counting normal criminal violence, we're only observing politically motivated violence. And so in those 4 odd years, 15 or more thousand people perished in terrible violence. And if you compare that with the preceding years, going all the way back to 1948, which really marked as the start of formal apartheid in South Africa, those 4 years were by far much more brutal and violent than all the years before combined. So can it really be said that our transition was a model transition to be emulated? I think we have to look a little more closely at what happened in those years. I recall those years with some horror, some trepidation, and a great deal of sadness. It certainly wasn't seamless, it certainly wasn't peaceful, it certainly was not straightforward. At the end of the day, however, the commitment to negotiate through people such as Nelson Mandela, with skillful people on both sides of the political spectrum, individuals such as Willis May on the part of the Nationalist Party, Cyril Ramaphosa on the part of the African National Congress, who found it within themselves to find common ground, eventually helped us to find a path through the brutality. We put in place different mechanisms. After the breakdown of the multi-party talks, we then put together another set of negotiations. We agreed to set up a transitional executive council, which had executive power. Under that council, we set up a range of technical subcommittees and we invited independent experts to sit on those committees. Those committees dealt with every single sector of society. They looked at how to reform different institutions, such as the security sector, the judiciary. They looked at law reform, constitutional reform. They looked at finance and a range of other activities. Out of that program, we agreed on a number of standards and principles. And ultimately, we broke those principles and values down to a number of 33 principles. And we said that whatever we do from now on, everything we do has to accord with those 33 principles, including the final constitution. But because we needed some ground rules to govern the transition, given how problematic it had been, we came up with an interim constitution which guaranteed fundamental rights and which ensured that minorities would not be discriminated pending the final constitution. Interestingly enough, that interim constitution, which took place, it was finalized in 1993, had a little document called a postscript that was attached to the back of that document. And it was that document that spoke of reconciliation, the need for national reconciliation. It spoke of the need for reparation as opposed to retribution. It spoke of the need to make sacrifices in order to cross the historic bridge from a past of oppression and brutality and violence to a future of democracy and the rule of law. And it specifically said that one of those sacrifices would be the need for a limited amnesty. So that then really set the framework for an important part of our transition going forward. You may ask, why did we agree to these kinds of sacrifices? Why would we allow perpetrators of some of the most heinous crimes an opportunity to escape justice? And the fundamental reason was we were in a bind. We were looking for ways to secure the buy-in and commitment of all parties, and in particular the security elements of the process going forward. And frankly, they wanted certain assurances. They wanted certain guarantees that we would not go after them. And we were not willing to give those guarantees, but we had to come up with some kind of compromise to guarantee their buy-in. And we did want their buy-in because we knew they were capable of causing massive disruption. At the time, I was in a small committee that was investigating hate squads within one of the police forces. And our investigations revealed that right-wing elements in collaboration with security forces had put together very substantial arms caches, including tens of thousands of group mines, artillery, rockets, and so on and so forth. We concluded that they had the capability to engage in insurrection that could last a decade and that potentially could destroy the country. And in fact, I reported this in a submission to the Transition Executive Council. And I said we either need to deal with these individuals in a security manner, or we need to engage in some kind of political action to neutralize them. And so that was the kind of context that we were dealing with, and we decided that we did have to make certain compromises. This compromise is often called the middle way. Archbishop Tutu is famous for talking about the third way. He said, on the one hand, we did not want to engage in Nuremberg-type trials in which we hold everybody before a public hearing. But on the other hand, we didn't want to engage in collective amnesia or a blanket wall-to-wall amnesty. And so the middle way was this truth for amnesty. Those who came forward and disclosed the full truth would be given an immunity from criminal prosecution, but also civil action as well. We really believe that this particular compromise was necessary at the time. There was another compromise that the government at the time wanted, and that was job security. Nobody wanted to be fired from their position simply because they were associated with the former oppressive regime. And I know this is certainly an issue that is faced by many countries in the Middle East and in North Africa region, what to do about individuals who have belonged to a ruling party that was corrupt and engaged in oppressive rule. And again, we took a pragmatic approach. We called it the sunset clause, or at least that was the name given to it by a senior member of the South African Communist Party. That compromise said that nobody would be dismissed or fired or demoted without good cause. It's certainly not because anybody belonged to a particular political party or happened to be in a particular position. Everybody's jobs were guaranteed at least until the next, rather the second general election. So 5 years of job security was introduced. So we didn't have to live with everybody occupying their current posts. This didn't mean, of course, that we couldn't engage in some institutional reform. And certain individuals were transferred into other positions, but with the same seniority and full benefits. Well, let's take a look at some of the mechanisms of the transition. And perhaps I'll start with the most famous one, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I suspect an audience of this nature probably is quite familiar with what happened. The commission was set up to search for the truth, to make findings about the past violations, and to make recommendations to prevent the repeat of those violations, and also recommendations for the redress or recompense for the harm suffered by many thousands of victims. In many respects, that commission was reasonably successful. It had a very expansive mandate. It had to look at what had taken place between 1960 and 1983. And as you all aware, those were some of the worst years of apartheid. Some 73,000 individuals were detained without trial. Countless numbers were tortured. Many disappeared. 7 million were forcibly displaced simply on grounds of their colour. And of course there was massive social and economic discrimination. As mentioned, the commission was in fact the only commission in the world that had the power to grant amnesty on the basis I've described, namely truth for amnesty. More than 7,000 perpetrators applied for amnesty. More than 5,000 were rejected. Around 800 applications were withdrawn. In the end, about 845 of the applications were actually granted. So, as you can see from this interesting setup, it wasn't premised entirely on impunity. It was more of a carrot and stick approach. The carrot being the grounds of immunity, so long as the full truth was disclosed. If the full truth was not disclosed, there would need to be some kind of consequence, some kind of follow-up. And that's why a system like this rests on a coherent justice policy. It means that you need to have strong investigative capacity, you need to have strong prosecutorial capacity, and of course you need to have independent judiciary as well. And of course you need the political will to in fact go through with your design, your promise to make good on the compromises that were made. Let's make a quick assessment of the results of what took place. I've spoken about the amnesty. The truth-seeking was not entirely incoherent, but I think it is true to say that much was done. Hearings were held in all parts of the country. Hundreds of victims were given a voice. Many came and testified publicly. Nearly 20,000 statements were taken from victims and witnesses. Hundreds of interviews were held. Many of those interviews were behind closed doors. I think quite good policy was generated in terms of reparations. I think the Commission can be described as independent. Most of the commissioners were credible and independent people. Some of them had a strong human rights track record. What many people don't know is that the Commission also had independent monitoring that was an offer made by the international community and accepted by the Commission. And we had experienced individuals from overseas police forces and human rights organizations who sat with the Commission from start to end. They had unhindered access to all our documents, all our investigations without exception. And they then wrote confidential reports both to the Commission and to the respective governments. And we believe that kind of monitoring helped us, one, to remain as professional as possible, but also to remain as objective as we possibly could. The report was issued in October of '98. It was a 5-volume report, comprising some 2,500 pages. I believe that the essential story was placed on the table. I also believe that certain important perpetrators were fingered or named and their roles exposed. I should have added that our Commission had certain powers that many commissions don't have, which is an investigative team. They had the power to subpoena individuals, force them to testify, force them to come to the Commission with documents, and if they don't, they committed a criminal offence and could go to jail. The Commission also had the power to get search orders from courts for inspections and searches, and they could even seize documents under the law. From time to time, those investigative powers were used to good effect. The Commission was also reasonably successful in tracing some remains of missing people, but of course many they didn't find. They were not particularly successful in investigating the role of the military. The military used various means and techniques to shield their role. The Commission has been criticised for adopting too much of a case-by-case approach. Well, to be fair to them, their mandate did require them to investigate cases of gross human rights violations. But this meant that they were so busy investigating so many cases that they weren't able to spend too much time investigating the deeper structural causes. And that's where I think they can be justly criticised. The strength, however, was the participatory process of that Commission. Most of the hearings were held in public, and that made an important break from earlier Truth Commission. The hearings were not public. Unless the Commission were dealing with children, with sexual violations, or confidential sources, the hearings were all public. They were often broadcast live. Every Sunday we had a a television program that would recap the previous week's events. And so in that way, the public got involved in what was going on, and it became that much more difficult for people to deny that they didn't know what had taken place during apartheid. Then and even now, it's common for white people to say, well, I didn't know what was happening. The fact that we had a truth commission makes that claim a little less credible. The Commission also, from time to time, was criticised for not observing procedural fairness, and some perpetrators went to court, and the courts ordered the Commission to observe strict procedural fairness, which I think was absolutely crucial in any investigation and Commission process. And essentially, the Commission was ordered to ensure that before findings were made, there were adverse findings, that the individuals involved had an opportunity to respond to those findings, and the Commission was required to consider those responses seriously. Did the Commission establish national reconciliation? After all, that was one of its key objectives, and the short answer is no. Frankly, to expect a commission that is around for a short time period, most inquiry only lasts 2 or 3 years, to expect it to deliver national reconciliation is an unrealistic proposition. The best that the South African Commission did was to offer a framework for national reconciliation to develop going forward. And frankly, we're still working on that. We still have a long way to go. Did the amnesty, the truth for amnesty, deliver much truth? Now that's an important question, because many of my colleagues and comrades will always say we needed this amnesty to deliver the truth. My own view is that we didn't get that much truth out of the truth for amnesty process. Now, why didn't we? You would think that the perpetrators were being offered immunity, and all they had to do was speak the full truth. But they were going to come forward in a cathartic display of compassion, contrition, and engage in an act of reconciliation by placing the full truth on the table. We saw from the figures that I provided you a little while back that this really didn't happen. And even if you look at the people who came forward, there were very few senior perpetrators, very few senior officers, very few senior politicians. A couple of exceptions here and there, but by and large they stayed away. Why did they stay away? And the reason is, perpetrators are by and large not the kind of people who want to come forward and speak for the sake of it. Generally speaking, perpetrators only come forward to speak the truth if they really have to. And they only really have to if you've got something on them. So what we discovered was that, particularly security officers, if we were investigating them, and they were aware that we had gathered evidence, and that a case was imminent, a prosecution was going to happen, they came forward, and what did they tell us? They only told us that they knew we had in our investigation files. So, if you think that you're just going to adopt a truth for amnesty process and there's going to be this outpouring of truth in some cathartic, explosive display, it's unlikely to happen. By and large, they're going to tell you what you know already. Alright, I'm going to finish off by talking about follow-up. Did we keep our promises to victims in terms of justice and reparations? And sadly, the answer to both those questions is in the negative. Let me deal with accountability and justice first. If we were serious about the design that we had set up, we would have put together a very serious investigative and prosecutorial approach together with our Truth Commission, but we didn't do that. We simply had the old unreformed police service with the old unreformed prosecutors and the old unreformed judiciary. We sort of expected these institutions to somehow deliver justice. Needless to say, that didn't happen. I was involved in an ad hoc investigation Although President Mandela provided our investigation with sufficient independence to allow us to find the evidence, we then had to give that evidence to prosecutors who were the older part of the prosecutors. We in turn had to give that evidence before the old judges, many of whom, in those days, all of whom were whites and mostly male, and mostly garden wall apartheid types. There were some exceptions. In the cases that we developed went before these individuals, most of them failed, unsurprisingly. Cases that were refused amnesty were meant to be at least investigated. We didn't expect prosecutions in every single case. I'm sorry to say that less than a handful have been taken forward, even though the Commission highlighted 300 specific cases in which there was cogent evidence and in which the victims and communities were seeking justice. As we speak today, none of those cases are before the courts. None have been resolved. Nobody has been convicted for any of those crimes. That's a shocking indictment of that particular program. I've had to represent a number of victims who are seeking, 50 years later, seeking justice. The state has even gone the extra mile to further promote impunity. They've even tried to introduce the amnesty process into the prosecutorial program by expanding the grounds upon which a prosecutor can decline to take a case forward. We need to go to court and have that struck down. Just in the past few years, we also had to go to court to strike down a new program of impunity, namely that of political pardons, which completely excluded victims from any participation. And today we are looking at private prosecutions in order to take some of these cases forward. In terms of reparations, the story is equally bleak. The Truth Commission recommended a coherent program of both individual and collective reparations. I'm told that mic is running out of battery. I might be running out of battery time. Yes, certainly when it comes to reparations, notwithstanding the interim constitution and its postscript, which said that victims must be given reparations, their harm must be redressed. We have completely failed reparation of these victims in that regard. All that's happened is a once-off pro-rata payment of around $3,000 per victim that took place in around 2000. It was only made to individuals who were lucky enough to see a statement taken before the Truth Commission, and that payment was made regardless of the nature of the harm suffered. If somebody was picked up and slapped around the wall for a couple of minutes, he or she got the same payment as somebody else who might have lost a breadwinner, who had their home destroyed, and who lost their entire livelihood. And again, today myself and others are engaged in an ongoing battle with government to meet up to their obligations to pay reparations. So far they have simply closed the door on victims. They've turned their backs on the very people who sacrificed so much for South Africa's new democracy. So, in conclusion, yes, there was something of a miracle that helped us to secure a transition to democracy that today we enjoy. However, to my mind, it's a blemished process with many faults and drawbacks. The main one being the fact that this celebrated program that is trumpeted around the world as a model of transition has unforgivably trashed tens of thousands of victims He gave so much for South African democracy. And in so doing, it really has demeaned South Africa's transition and added considerably to the trauma of the victims who have already suffered so much. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
شكرا هاورد. أنا دلوقتي هحاول سريعا أربط الكلام اللي قاله هاورد في شباب السياق بتاع الصراع السياسي او الانتقال السياسي في مصر واطروحات العداله الانتقاليه في مصر، وبعدين هنفتح المجال للنقاش والاسئله والتعليقات. احنا في 2011 وفي 2012 كنا انا ومجموعه من الزملاء منهم ناس كتير حاضرين معانا النهارده اشتغلنا وتعاطينا مع موضوع العداله الانتقاليه كجزء من اليات الانتقال السياسي الديمقراطي. والتعاطي طبعا اختلف جدا عن التعاطي مع الموضوع ده من تحديدا طبعا من 30 يونيو ومن منتصف 2013. كنا دايما بنضطر ان احنا نشتبك مع التجربه بتاعت جنوب افريقيا لانها تجربه مشهوره جدا وتجربه بيتم استدعائها دايما، وكان بيتم استدعائها بصوره متكرره في مصر. وكان الاشتباك ده بيجي من تحديدا بيبقى مرتكز على محورين. النقطه الاولى هو ان احنا نحاول نوضح ان التجربه بتاعت جنوب افريقيا ما كانتش زي ما هاورد باين في النقاش في الكلام اللي قاله، ما كانتش تجربه ورديه جدا، وان الصراعات السياسيه ما بتنتهيش فجاه ونادرا ما بتنتهي بمنتصر صريح ومنهزم صريح. وطبعا ده ما كانتش حاله في جنوب افريقيا. يمكن من المعلومات الصادمه الناس كتير ما تعرفهاش الكلام اللي هاورد قاله، ان هو عدد الضحايا اللي سقطوا في الاربع سنين بتاع المفاوضات او الفتره بتاعت انهاء الصراع اكبر من عدد الضحايا اللي سقطوا في كل فتره النظام الفصل العنصري اللي بتبدا من سنه 48. والحاجه الثانيه اللي هي فكره المصالحه والعفو، فكره العفو والمصالحه اللي هي تجربه لها ما لها وعليها ما عليها في جنوب افريقيا، لكن الشيء الاكيد انها ما كانش ليها علاقه خالص بالطريقه اللي بيتم استدعائها بيها في الجدال المصري، الجدال في السياق المصري. كانت دايما بيشار اليها كانها مصالحه، بمعنى ان هو صدر امر المصالحه وتم تجاهل الماضي تماما. زي ما شفنا في الكلام اللي قاله هاورد، هي كانت اقرب لعمليه مقايضه. لجنه الحقيقه بتحصل على يعني المفروض انها بتحاول تقايض الحقيقه مقابل قرارات عفو مشروطه، المفروض انها كان يتبعها في حاله رفض العفو محاسبه جنائيه، ودي اللي تعطلت شويه في السنوات الاخيره. ده المحور الاول الاشتباك. المحور الثاني كان ان احنا كنا، انا بتكلم طبعا عن نفسي وعن مجموعه من الزملاء هنا في المبادره وفي الجماعه الوطنيه لحقوق الانسان بيشتغلوا اكثر مننا على العداله الانتقاليه وفي منظمات حقوقيه ثانيه واطراف اخرى فاعله سياسيا. كنا بنحاول ندفع في اتجاه اقرب شويه بالتجارب بتاعت امريكا اللاتينيه اللي انا شخصيا كنت منحاز ليها شويه، التجارب بتاعت الارجنتين وتشيلي وبيرو اللي هي كان فيها تركيز اكبر على المحاسبه الجنائيه، وفيها نجاح اكبر بكثير لعمليه المحاسبه الجنائيه، محاسبه الموظفين الامنيين تحديدا موظفين الاجهزه الامنيه على الجرائم اللي ارتكبت في الماضي، طبعا مع الاخذ في الاعتبار اختلاف شكل الصراع ما بين امريكا اللاتينيه وجنوب افريقيا ومصر. الاختلاف طبعا في 2013 اللي يخلينا بنحاول دلوقتي ان احنا نتعاطى مع الموضوع بصوره مختلفه هو ان شكل الصراع في مصر اصبح اكثر تعقيدا بكثير. يعني هو ما عادش عندك دوله ارتكبت عدد من الجرائم اللي هي برضه حجمها صغير ويسهل توثيقها ضد اطراف. يعني الموضوع اصبح اكثر تعقيدا، بمعنى ان هو انا بقى عندي، انا كنت متمسك بحاجه معينه باليات معينه للعداله الانتقاليه، وبقيت مهزوز شويه من ناحيتها. يعني ما عادش واثق 100% انا عايز ايه او ايه اللي ممكن تطبيقه في مصر. لكن الشيء الاكيد اللي انا متاكد منه ان هو كل ما تورطت الاطراف اكثر في الصراع وكل ما الدم زاد وسقط عدد اكبر من الضحايا، كل ما احنا بنبعد، ودي الواقع اللي احنا لازم نواجهه، بنبعد عن امكانيه تحقيق العداله الانتقاليه بصوره شامله، خصوصا فيما يتعلق بالمحاسبه على جرائم الماضي وجبر الضرر والمحاسبه الجنائيه. ده مش معناه ان الموضوع اصبح مستحيل، بس بيزداد صعوبه. كل ما الصراع يطول يزداد صعوبه. النقطه الثانيه ان هو كمان احنا دلوقتي، يعني احنا كنا بنتكلم مع هاورد قبل الحوار ما يبدا، وكان بيقول ان مصر دولة واحده من دولتين في العالم، الثانيه هي تونس. طبعا الوضع عندها احسن شويه، عندها وزير العداله الانتقاليه، فده يعني الشكل الخارجي كده يوحي ان احنا عندنا عمليه للتصالح مع الماضي مش موجود عندهم كتير جدا، احنا اهتمينا بيها لدرجه ان احنا عملنا لها وزنات. بس الشيء برضو اللي باين في السبع 8 شهور اللي فاتوا ان هو العداله الانتقاليه لما بتستخدم في سياق، احنا في صراع سياسي، احنا مش عارف نستخدم مفردي، فلما بتستخدم في صراع سياسي ممكن تستخدم بشكل اقرب للعداله الانتقاليه. في مقاله جميله كتبها زميلي محمد الشيوي عن العداله الانتقاليه، انصحكم انكم تقروها. فالموضوع في الحقيقه محتاج ان احنا نبتدي نتعاطى معاه بصوره مختلفه شويه، لان هو التصريح اللي قاله وزير العداله الانتقاليه بتاع ان هو لا وقت العداله الانتقاليه، انا شايف ان هو تصريح في محله، وطبعا الفرق ان هو يعني هو كان المفروض يستقيل بعد التصريح ده، انا مش عارف هو يقصد ايه بالظبط انه قاله وفضل مكمل في شغلانته، بس هو من وجهه نظر ما انا شايف فعلا ان هو العداله الانتقاليه دي خطيره، يبقى تستخدم لانتقام الاطراف معينه، ما هياش اليه لتحقيق العداله وما هياش اليه لتحقيق لمنع تكرار الانتهاكات والاصلاح المؤسسات، كل دي حاجات المفروض العداله الانتقاليه بتحققها. فبالتالي انا مثلا عندي بعض الاختلاف للاسف الزملاء من الجماعه الوطنيه لحقوق الانسان هم اكثر ناس بيشتغلوا بجهد حقيقي على موضوع العداله الانتقاليه، ما فيش حد موجود من النهارده زي احمد راغب واحمد حشمت وايضا حجازي، لكن هم ما زالوا بيتفقوا في اتجاه كان في قانون للعداله الانتقاليه كنا اشتغلنا عليه مع بعض في 2012، هم طبعا يعني اشتغلوا عليه اكثر مننا وطرحوه ساعتها مجلس الشعب وطرح على يعني جهات حكوميه مختلفه في الحكومات اللي تعاقبت على مصر منذ الثوره، وطبعا ما فيش اي حد فيهم تبناه لان ما كانش فيه اراده سياسيه. انا شخصيا متخوف من الطرف في الوقت الحالي، لكن هم بيطرحوا العداله الانتقاليه كآلية لانهاء الصراع، ودي الحاجه اللي انا مش متاكد منها واحب اسمع رايكم فيها، وهنفتح النقاش للناس اللي عايزه تشترك مع الافكار اللي قالها هاور، اللي عايزه تساله اسئله او اللي عايزه تعلق وتتكلم على موضوع العداله الانتقاليه في السياق المصري. شكرا. اللي عايز يسأل يا جماعه يرفع ايده، اللي عايز
أنا عاوز تبقى أحد مؤسسين القضايا الشعبية العدالة الغير شأنين أول طبعا مؤسسين وفي نفس الوقت عضو الجماعة الوطنية الشعبية. عايز بس أقول إن ممكن نبتدي بالأول خالص، لأن أنا عارف إن الترتيب الأولي العملية بتاعت المسألات كتير من أهل الحقيقة والحقيقة تنتشر، وبعد كده نبتدي ناخد القرار بقى البنائي والقبر الضرر والاشتراك في المراحل المختلفة من العملية نوصل لمصالحة في الصناعة. ده مفهوم نظريا، ولكن يمكن احنا في البداية 25 يناير نحرك الناس تاني عشان الطمع بتاع الجانب. أنا الواحد بسائل وبراجع نفسي وأحس الناس بتقرأ نصوص معايا ومش مرتبط ولا لا. إن الأولوية كانت إن إحنا نركز في إصلاح الوجود بتاع الجهاز الأمن بس قبل ما ندخل أي شرعية كرامة مسؤولية وأقل. لأن ده لو كان تم كان ممكن نبتدي نكسب أرض أكتر. الموضوع ما وضحش قوي لأن النهارده إحنا عندنا انتقام من الضحايا ومن الجماعات بفضل السلطة حديثا في مصر بتفضل من أفراد الجهاز الأمني بشكل أو بآخر. فأنا بقول ممكن نعمل حاجة زي الغيطين لما يقولوا لا وقتية هي عبارة هو إن أنت تخلي القسم قدامك يضربك وأنت تستغل حركته عشان تقدر تدرك. فدي انا ما اقدرش استغل ده، ما احاولش اركز ان احنا نستغل الانتقاد مش هدفه النهارده عشان ما تستغلش. يعملوا اصلاح مؤسسي، اصلاح مؤسسي هيخلي دي عداله، هيخلي الناس محبوبه اكتر، هيخلي الناس تتعاطف معاكم اكتر، وبالتالي لما حد يجي يعتدي عليكم هيبقى الموضوع ممكن الناس تدافع عنكم بدل ما هي تستحسن ده المقطع عليكم تستحسن ده النهارده بشكل قرار او ابنه او ايا كان اصابه او قتل او بس الكلام ده او
ولي محروس ده السياسي والفصل على المدنية وعضو الجمعية الشعبية العدالة. أنا بس بعد السياسة اللي دي أفريقيا معظم المنطقات كده أكثر عظمة وأكثر العدالة الانتقالية والحقوق. أحب بس أقول بس الكلمة الثانية كمان قوية جدا اللي أنا عندي هنا، ويقولوا ده بالتحديد تعتبر هي الأمل حالة زي حالتنا، لأن قعدوا 10 سنين وعدم دي كده مش حقيقية، لكن إذا المجتمع المدني بس لوحده هو اللي يمكن يستفيد. احنا في السنة بكرة نقدر نعمل الدولة المصرية إن إحنا ما نكونش دلوقتي محتاجين الحقيقة قوي لأن إحنا قادرين على فضل الحقيقة إن إحنا محتاجين الآية الخامسة اللي هي بتاعت الذاكرة الوطنية. إحنا 25 يناير من أول شوية بشوية بعد ما كانت ثورة إلى الجيل الرابع للحروب إلى نفس 25 يناير والمشاهد الوطنية. هنلاقيكم دلوقتي يعني إحنا محتاجين يمكن قبل القانون وقبل الكلام ده احنا محتاجين جهاز القوى الوطنيه ان احنا نثبت واقع الاحداث عشان ما نبقاش نسكيله وما يبقاش كل الناس اللي موجوده على الارض وتقول في الاخر الى الوطن. بس النقطه اللي احب اوجهها يمكن دي الحاجه اللي احنا شويه نعلمها. انت كشخص ابيض وبدات تتكلم على المصالح في جنوب افريقيا مع السوق وجيت ازاي انت وقرايبك واصحابك والناس اللي موجودين حواليك اللي تعتقد ان انت عايز تعمل مصالحه مع ناس ادنى منك وجيت ازاي بعد كده ربطه الانتقاليه قويه جدا من قبل السوق وبالتالي كده
ممكن ناخد سؤال كمان ولا
أنا اسمي أحمد أبو زيد وأنا عضو مركز تنظيم المباريات في الوقت. يعني أنا كنت حابب أسمع منكم يعني الجمعية المصرية يعني تطبيقكم مع الأحداث السياسية. أنا صحيح عضو بس إحنا بنسمع كلام هو حبيت اسمع كلام تاني يعني عايز اشوف الصوره من وجهه النظر الثانيه. حاولت ان انتم تعملوا عداله انتقاليه لمده سنتين وقدمتوا مشاريع لمجلس الشعب. انا يعني المعلومات اللي عندي كامله واقعيه ما نقدرش ننفذها. انا بفتح فيها فانا جاي اسمع واضح انه المشكله يعني وعندنا مشكله ومفروض نسمع يمكن بطريقه احسن المجتمع المدني. فانا يا ريت تفيد في القصه دي يعني لو وقت نفهمها ايه كواليس تمثيلها ازاي يعني ليه دي بلد نجحت ليه نجحت ليه في الارجنتين نجحت في العداله ليه عندنا ما
ممكن نرد ونعلق على الاسئله وبعدين ناخد لفه كمان من الاسئله والتعليقات. يعني انا هرد على سؤال عشان في سؤال حاجه انا اشتغلت عليها موجه ليا لكن انا بشجع الناس على الاعلانات كلها ايه تتحاور مع بعض. يعني هو دلوقتي الموضوع بقى اقرب للنقاش فهرد الاول وبعدين ادي كلمه لزميلي هاول. اللي انا هقوله هيرد على السؤال الاولاني والسؤال الثالث لان هو كان فيه كلام عن موضوع الاجهزه الامنيه. طبعا يعني احنا ما اخترناش اصلاح الشرطه كاولويه لكن هو في الاخر سواء اصلاح الشرطه او مساله العداله الانتقاليه فهي السبب الرئيسي عشان نتكلم باختصار شديد طبعا اللي خلاها فشلت او ما اتحققتش هو غياب الاراده السياسيه عشان نكون واقعيين. يعني باختصار شديد مش يعني الانتقال الديمقراطي الحقيقي الديمقراطيه مش هتحصل الا لما يكون في ديمقراطيه في الحكم. هو ده حاجه ما حصلناش عليها في السنتين ونص او في الثلاث سنين اللي فاتوا. في نقطه ثانيه طبعا بعيدا عن الاراده السياسيه عشان برضه نكون الكلام واقعي. حتى انت لما تكون في السلطه وانت ديمقراطي وعندك الاراده السياسيه حاجه لها علاقه بموازنات القوى. موازين القوى بتخلقها اللحظه واحنا طبعا موازين القوى كانت مش دايما كانت سيئه على عكس ما ده طبعا الاخوان. في بعض الحالات كانت يعني مثلا انا اذكر شخصيا من شغلي ما بعد ما ازدحت بورسعيد كان عندنا فرصه كبيره جدا لان احنا نعمل تدخل على مستوى اصلاح الشرطه وساعتها اشتغلنا مع البرلمان وكان في ضغط كبير مش بس من قطاع الناس المؤمنه بالثوره لكن من قطاعات شعبيه واسعه والشرطه كانت ضعيفه ودي فرصه تم اهدارها وتم اهدارها عن وعي. تم اهدارها بسبب ان كان في مجموعه ناس في السلطه مش مهتمه يعني الموضوع مش اولوي بالنسبه لها وبتحاول تصل لموائمات مع الاجهزه الامنيه ومن غير ما تاخد اي حاجه في المقابل. يعني انا ما عنديش رفض بالضروره لفكره الموائمات اللي بتقررها اللحظه بس تاخد حاجه في المقابل. فاحنا عشان ارد بالتفصيل اكتر انا شخصيا انا ممكن اتكلم عن موضوع يعني انا اشتغلت على الجانب بتاع اصلاح الشرطه المتعلق هو شق من يعني من مكونات العداله الانتقاليه ويمكن اللي كان افضل يتكلم بس انا اشتغلت معاهم شويه فهتكلم بالنيابه عنهم الزملاء في الجماعه الوطنيه لحقوق الانسان احمد راغب والمجموعه بتاعته عن مشروع قانون العداله الانتقاليه. احنا شغلنا في غياب طبعا اراده سياسيه من السلطه التنفيذيه كنا بنحاول نضغط على الاطراف المختلفه من اجل تبني افكار مختلفه متعلقه باصلاح الشرطه المعلومه اللي انت بتقولها يعني في تقديري مش صحيحه. احنا قدمنا قانون فيما يتعلق باصلاح الشرطه، قدمنا قانون لمجلس الشعب اللي ساعتها طبعا الاغلبيه فيه كانت اغلبيه، الاكثريه كانت الاخوان. قدمنا واشتغلنا مع لجنه الدفاع، والكلام طبعا ممكن دخلنا في السجن دلوقتي، اشتغلنا مع لجنه الدفاع والامن القومي عشان نحاول نطرح افكار لاصلاح الشرطه. كتبنا لهم القانون، هم قالوا لنا منتصر احنا ما عندناش خبره قانونيه. كتبنا لهم القانون، وقانون الشرطه ما كانش قانون يعني ما كانش راديكالي قوي، يعني ما كانش، كان في شويه افكار بعيده المدى، وكان في افكار ممكن تتنفذ على المدى القريب قابله للتنفيذ، مش محتاجه موارد ماليه ضخمه، وممكن تتنفذ ببعض التفاوض مع السلطه خصوصا في ظل لحظات ضعفها او انهيارها زي لحظه ما بعد بورسعيد، وحاجات قابله للتنفيذ يعني. لكن اللي حصل ان هم في الاخر مجلس الشعب رحب بالقانون، وفي الاخر حطوا في الدرج وكانت شهرين، وفي الاخر طلع بالقانون بيدي شويه علاوات لامناء الشرطه وافراد الشرطه وضباط الشرطه، وحاجه احنا ضحينا بيها في المسجد. يعني احنا كنا مقتنعين بان ده لازم يكون جزء من عمليه الاصلاح، انك تحسن ظروف العمل بتاعتهم. لكن هو ده كان الحاجه الوحيده في مشروع القانون، وغير المحكمات العسكريه لامناء وافراد الشرطه. فهو في الاخر يعني نجح، مش عارف بقى رضخ بالضغوط ولا هو قرر ان هو مشكله طبعا السلطه، مشكله جماعه الاخوان المسلمين او حزب الحريه والعداله، ان هم كان بالنسبه لهم دايما الافضل، هم كانوا شايفين ان التحالف اللي عايزين يخلقوه هو التحالف مع اجهزه الامن، والتحالف ده فشل. فهي في الاخر عمليه صناعه تحالفات، عرفت تصنع تحالف اجتماعي يسندك في عمليه الاصلاح هتعرف تعملها. هم كان عندهم رؤيه مختلفه والموضوع فشل والظروف اصعب بكثير دلوقتي. مشروع قانون العداله الانتقاليه الزميل احمد راغب قدمه لمجلس الشعب وتبناه ساعتها نائب مصطفى النجار، يعني برضه الاحزاب بقى. وانا شخصيا كنت شايف ان القانون يمكن صعب شويه التنفيذ او كنت مختلف مع بعض الاوجه فيه. كان في اليات كويسه، كان في اليه للوصول للحقيقه، لجنه حقيقه كويسه جدا. انا بس كنت متخوف من موضوع فكره المحاسبه الجنائيه في ظل وجود اجهزه قضائيه غير مستقله، ودي حاجه اتكلم عليها الزميل هاود، يعني ان هو ازاي الموضوع تعثر لما قدموا نتائج تحقيقات لاجهزه قضائيه ما حصلش فيها اصلاح والموضوع فشل في الاخر. بس كان مشروع متكامل وقابل للتعديل يعني، لكن هو في الحقيقه طبعا البرلمان اتحل بعدها بكتير. ومن ساعتها الفكره كمان حزب التيار المصري كان هو الحزب الوحيد اللي تبناها بتاعت مجلس الشورى، وكان في مقاومه شديده ساعتها من كل مكونات السلطه، يعني ساعتها كان في سواء من السلطه التنفيذيه او السلطه القضائيه او حزب الحريه والعداله اللي كان في السلطه، كان في مقاومه للافكار دي. فالموضوع في الاخر فضل يعني هو نقاش موجود كده في المجال العام، لكن عمر ما في اي حد في السلطه خد الجديه. يعني ما وصلناش من حد على موضوع العداله الانتقاليه، ما كانش في تعليق من حد ان هو القانون صعب وكذا، هو كان في تجاهل يعني لحد ما. وطبعا تحالفات السلطه بتبطل في مصر في خلال سنه، يعني بدون مفاصل كده، فما بنعرفش ايه اللي كان ممكن يحصل. وطبعا الوضع دلوقتي اصعب بكتير، يعني هو مشاريع قوانين موجوده، الافكار موجوده، افكار اصلاح الشرطه يعني احنا طورناها 3-4 مرات، وكان فيها ناس ضباط شرطه سابقين وحاليين ساهموا فيها. في افكار واقعيه موجوده، لكن الظروف وتوازنات القوى والاراده السياسيه هي اللي بتبقى مش الحقيقه مش مناسبه. وهدي الكلام
I believe about 4 questions that I should address. The first one being the question posed by Karen: is transitional justice a solution to conflict? That's a very interesting question, and I suppose an important one for Egypt. I would love to say that it is a solution, but I better be responsible and say no, it's certainly not a solution to conflict. If anything, if we were to look at traditional justice as we understand it in its traditional conventional sense, it's really there to redress past conflicts and to build upon a future in which such conflicts or violations won't take place again. So simply the things that we have done under transitional justice, be it truth seeking, be it pursuing justice itself, undertaking reforms and providing reparations, those things in themselves will not stop conflict. Obviously, there are many other things that conceivably could be done to stop conflict, but I suspect that they fall out of the strict confines of transitional justice. And I suppose we're really talking about negotiations, painstaking negotiations, compromises, mediations, so on and so forth. So yes, the transition is much bigger than transitional justice, which I think is potentially quite narrow in scope. A few comments on the question of reforming the police and other important institutions. Yeah, I mean, this is such a critical process. Sadly, as Graham will tell you, reforming an institution like the police, like the military, intelligence agencies, the judiciary, and so on. These are monumental exercises. They take sometimes years of just research, planning, strategizing, conceptualizing. The actual reforms could take a generation to be implemented. I'm not saying that we shouldn't start and we shouldn't start early. What I'm saying is that reforms of institutions generally don't deliver quickly. If they're going to be done properly, you have to take a long view, and one has to be patient. That being the case, what can be done in the interim period? Because after all, you're facing pressing issues right now. People are being shot in the streets. Abuses are being committed in cells and prisons and the like. I think there are some things that can be done pending long-term reforms, and let's consider the police and perhaps look at what has happened in a couple of other countries. Starting with South Africa, we came to the conclusion in the mid-1990s that the existing police forces, mainly the South African police force itself, and the police forces of the Bantustan, of the Homeland Systems, could not be trusted under any circumstances. In fact, we regarded them as gangsters, as criminals, people who would commit crimes and then come to so-called investigate. We couldn't trust them, by and large, to engage in good faith policing. And of course, there is a generalization because there are exceptions to the rule, and I had the privilege of working with some fantastic, good, honest police officers and detectives, but that was sadly the exception, not the rule. I think there is cause or grounds for setting up interim bodies to deal with interim pressing situations. So in the mid-1990s, when we had that horrendous conflict, and because we couldn't trust the police, we decided that we would set up a independent, separate body that would engage in public order security, public order policing. We had a national peace accord, and we decided to set up a national police, not police, a national peace, as in PEACE, a national peace force. They would comprise of trusted individuals from all the different security services, and they would be monitored by international observers. They would even have different uniforms and different vehicles, so they could be distinguished from other security services. And they were only to be used in the context of political tension and political violence. They weren't there to investigate normal crime. They were only there to deal with political protests and rallies, which are often the site of a great deal of tension and a great deal of mob violence. So you generally would not have, as has happened unfortunately in Cairo and in other places, police and military personnel lined up with automatic weapons firing into a crowd. This force would not do that sort of thing. They were trained to deal with crowd control. They were trained to use minimum force. They were trained not to resort to lethal force at the first instance. They had their successes, but they also had some failures as well. But by and large, we felt that it was an interim solution to a pressing problem, a viable solution for us over a period of just 2 to 3 years. I have to say that some of those lessons have not been learned by the current day South African Police Service. And for those of you who follow South Africa, you would have seen footage of the police firing sharp-point ammunition into a crowd, killing more than 30 striking miners at a terrible incident in South Africa last year. Setting up interim bodies to deal with special solutions can also be done in other sectors as well. Certainly when it comes to the judiciary, we've often seen in several countries around the world, Rwanda being one of them, but not just at the international level, also at the domestic level, exactly, of independent panels of carefully selected jurors, respected for their commitment to human rights and known for their independence to adjudicate these sensitive, politically charged trials. The same, of course, goes for prosecutors and investigators. And this is, of course, pending long-term reforms of the judiciary and the whole criminal justice system. There was a question, a more personal one, how did I deal with the whole reconciliation issue and my own family and the retaliation of blacks? Yeah, I suppose I need to do some reflection on that. Certainly when it comes to my own family, there were members of my family who were very critical of me and the role that I was playing, and that I had become something of a sellout, of the people that I should have been committed to, and selling out the greater cause. And some of them even disowned me during the 1980s. They felt that I was something of a radical, somebody that they shouldn't be associated with. I'm happy to say that eventually through the course of the 1990s, and they saw the role that people like Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu were playing, my own father and a few others came to me and said, you know what, we made a mistake. We now see that what is happening in South Africa should have happened decades ago. So yes, it was an interesting personal journey. Speaking about the retaliation of blacks, if you're talking about whether there was a backlash against whites after democracy, interestingly enough, the answer is no. It simply didn't happen, which really speaks enormously about the integrity and the humanity of black South Africans, that by and large do not see it within themselves to engage in that kind of retaliation. I know of no serious incidents in which blacks have gratuitously attacked whites in the democratic South Africa. Because we're not talking about armed robberies and violent crime which cuts across the colour bar. And yes, South Africa is plagued by criminal violence. But we're talking about that kind of racial violence against whites. It simply hasn't happened. However, the reverse has happened even in the New South Africa. There have been bombings of supermarkets where blacks are known to shop, as well as at other public places where blacks are known together, and many black people died well into the New South Africa through racially inspired bombings and attacks. There have also been mob violence against black people in isolated communities. I'm happy to say that by and large, haven't been too many of those, and by and large, thing of the past. When I spoke about political pardons, the government, in fact the president, was even offering pardons to those neo-Nazi thugs who had engaged in racist violence against black people well into the new democracy. And I was part of the legal team that went to court to stop those pardons from being granted to individuals such as those racist thugs. And luckily the court agreed with us that they should face justice. Finally, another difficult question why has Argentina and South Africa been successful, but Egypt not? Again, very complex, and we probably don't have time to go into the nuts and bolts, but in short, Egypt is where Argentina was, if we have to make a comparison, perhaps in the mid to late 1980s. And if we look at South Africa, perhaps in the, Egypt is now in the early 1990s. And if you look at those two countries in those time periods, they were also up against a wall. Certainly in South Africa in the early 1990s, massacres were commonplace. Although I have to say that the massacres that have taken place in Egypt in recent times have been much more serious than the massacres we experienced. But we also had terrible drive-by shootings and lots of gratuitous mob violence. So you have to take a view that is not a short-term one. Things don't happen quickly. Some people would even say that we are still engaged in a transitional process, some 15 years after we finished our Truth Commission. But certainly it took some 5-6 years for us to get through a very painful process.
ممكن ناخد تعليقات أو أسئلة كمان. في حد؟ حد رافع ايده؟
انا كنت عايز اسال سؤال تاني يعني لو سمحت. كنت عايز اسال استاذ هارون اذا كان الساحه الدوليه بتلعب دور في انه مثلا
It's my turn again. I'll speak in English this time. I'd like to ask about the dilemma between local and global standards for transitional justice. I know that in Rwanda, for judicial system, they benefited from local values there for the Shakaka courts, and I know it was a liberal baby born as an ideology, the transitional justice, and maybe this is causing many problems when we try to apply it in different societies. What do you think about that?
The questions are becoming more difficult and complex. Although the first one I think is fairly straightforward, the question of sanctions as a legitimate tool of pressure and whether it could be used legitimately and effectively in relation to Israel. Again, I'm no expert on the Middle East, but I do believe that sanctions is a legitimate tool that can be used for purposes of applying pressure on a state that violates international human rights norms and standards. Certainly that was the case in South Africa. Economic sanctions was used against South Africa with devastating effect. If it worked there, I think there's at least a reasonable prospect that it could work with some effect in relation to a state like Israel, or frankly any other state that violates international human rights. So it certainly is worth trying in my view. The next question related to reconciliation and the question of religion and ideology. And thanks for painting the picture and the context of Egypt. I have to say that kind of polarization makes the situation in Egypt and also to some degree in other countries in the region also going through transition, particularly difficult. These are obstacles that most other countries that emerging from conflict didn't have to deal with. Most conflicts tend to deal with issues around ethnicity and nationalism, and how those things are tied up in relation to access to political power and economic resources. Here you have those things, but now you also have, as you mentioned, the added schism, or in the case of Egypt it might even be called chasm, between those on the secular side and those on the religious or other side. And as you mentioned, the labeling of some as terrorists and counter-revolutionaries is not conducive to creating a climate where meaningful reconciliation can take place. And so for starters, I think that kind of labeling should stop. It certainly isn't possible to refer to all people belonging to a certain movement as terrorists. Yes, there might be individuals promoting and engaging in terrorism, but there certainly can't be the majority. If one is serious about reaching out, then one has to involve individuals on all sides of the conflict. And the starting point would be to avoid name-calling and labeling. It does involve shifting attitudes. It does involve creating a new commitment to a society that is tolerant of all beliefs. Beyond that, it is really something that Egyptians have to work on and have to try and find solutions to. I don't believe it's something that a South African or somebody else who's been through another transition can come forward and suggest a way forward. All I can tell you that it's going to be extremely tough and a long and painstaking road, but it is one you have to go down. The final question dealt with local and international standards, and thanks for raising the example of Rwanda, where you had different processes happening at different levels. There, of course, was the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which actually wasn't even based in Rwanda, but dealt with crimes against humanity and genocide. That was a response of the international community to the awful acts of genocide that took place in Rwanda. But it wasn't the only response. There were trials that happened in the domestic criminal justice system. And of course, you mentioned the gacaca system as well. I'm not a Rwandan expert, and I actually haven't done any work in Rwanda, but from what I've been able to read and hear others speaking about, some describe the approach of gacaca, which was a mixture of restorative and retributive justice that took place at the community level, run largely by community elders. Some described it as an innovative approach to criminal justice, because there was simply no way that the normal criminal justice system could deal with hundreds of thousands of different cases. Having said that, others have said that system fell way short of international best practice and international standards of norms. In fact, many are concerned that innocent people, their rights may not have been given sufficient protection during those procedures, and there has been some speculation as to how many people were convicted of serious crimes and in fact sentenced to serious jail time through the gacaca process without recourse to due process. So yes, there certainly is room for exploring local solutions, and it has been tried in many different countries, and Uganda is beginning to look at a very interesting approach in using traditional forms of justice and truth-seeking as a substitute to criminal justice. And I think these things should be encouraged, but as you suggested, there ought to be minimum standards. Basic due process should be respected. It's certainly not acceptable that individuals can be held to account and punished without getting a fair hearing. And of course, if the crimes in question are of a very serious nature, such as murder, abduction, enforced disappearances, rape and other sexual crimes, I for one don't subscribe to the view that those kinds of crimes should be subject to any leniency. Even though in my own country we did just that, although not in the case of sexual crimes. I think that's what I have to say on that.
طيب انا هحاول برضه اشترك مع الكلام اللي قاله ادم، لان هو احنا اتناقشنا النقاش ده قبل كده كتير، وسمعت انا السؤال ده قبل كده كتير، والحقيقه ان هو يعني في تقديري ان هو مش كل الصراعات او عمليات الانتقال السياسي بتنجح عن طريق ثوره اجتماعيه مكتمله وناجحه بتعمل نقله نوعيه على مستوى الفكر او على مستوى الايديولوجيا. مش بالضروره، يعني في حالات كتير من حالات الانتقال السياسي والتحول السياسي للديمقراطي او التحول السياسي الايجابي بتحصل، او يعني حالات من الصراعات بتنتهي لمجرد ان الناس تعبت او زهقت او الدوله فلست، وده اللي احنا في الغالب هيحصل لنا في مصر. يعني الدوله ممكن تفضل تحارب الارهاب بنفس الاصرار ده وهتفلس قريب جدا في الغالب، والتيار الاسلامي برضه ممكن يفضل او قطاعات من التيار الاسلامي متمسك بتأزيم الموضوع ومتمسك بايديولوجيته، وفي الاخر مثلا هيخسر ويزهق. يعني ما هو ده بيحصل في حالات كتير، وده بيبقى شكل من اشكال انهاء الصراع، وبيبدا بعدها عمليه تفاوض، وممكن يحصل بعدها عمليه انتقال سياسي. لان هو اللي اقصده يعني ان انت ممكن، احنا دلوقتي عشان عايشين اللحظه دي، حده المواقف الايديولوجيه سواء الوطنيه او الاسلاميه بتبان انها خطيره جدا، لكن الهستيريا مش بتطول قوي، يعني ممكن تاخد وقت طويل، ممكن تاخد وقت قصير، بس لازم نفضل دايما فاكرين انه مقوله الامل خيانه دي ما تنطبقش علينا احنا بس، هم كمان الاطراف الثانيه التي تمتلك قوه تمسكها قوي بمواقفها الحاده زي ما احنا كنا متمسكين كده مش هيطول، بس هو ممكن يطول اكتر مننا عشان هم معاهم سلاح وعشان هم معاهم فلوس، بس فلوسهم ما تخلص. فهي احنا كلنا الحقيقه الوضع سيء جدا بالنسبه لنا، يعني على مستوى الدوله وعلى مستوى المجتمع. احنا انا اتذكر نقاش شهير، النقاش ده كان طرح فيه السؤال ده بتاع كيف تنتهي الصراعات وكيف تبدا عمليه الانتقال السياسي وكيف تتحقق المصالحه الوطنيه، وحد قام مشغل فيديو كده لمجموعه من الانترفيوهات اللي كانت معموله في الشارع من ناس تنتمي الى الطرفين، والطرفين كانوا بيقولوا حاجات كتير من قبيل ان هو لا، ازاي يحصل مصالحه مع مجرمين، ازاي يحصل مصالحه مع ارهابيين. والحقيقه من التجربه التاريخيه بتعلمنا ان المصالحه ما بتحصلش غير مع مجرمين وارهابيين، يعني مش صحاب بيتخانقوا مع بعض وبيتصالحوا. يعني هو في الحقيقه كل ما الصراع بيطول كل ما انت بتبقى مجبر في الاخر انك تعمل مصالحه مع مجرمين وارهابيين. يمكن ده الحاجه اللي احنا لازم نحطها دايما في الاعتبار وفي في ذهننا، يعني واحنا بنخوض الصراعات دي، واللي هو الحاجه اللي احنا نقدر نعمله ان احنا نضغط على الاطراف الفاعله سواء القوى الوطنيه او القوى الاسلاميه ان احنا نفكرهم بالموضوع ده. تبص على تجارب اللي انا بكلمك عليها اللي مش بقول يعني انها بالضروره تجارب مطابقه لحالتنا، بس التجارب اللي الصراع انتهى فيها بسبب انه اخذ وقت يخلص، ان هو ما عادش فيه امكانيه للاستثمار في الصراع اكتر من كده. سواء بقى الجزائر او لبنان هتلاقي ان هو صراع طويل جدا واتصرف فيه فلوس كتير جدا ومات فيه عدد كبير جدا من الضحايا، ففي الاخر نفس الاطراف اللي هي كانت في قمه الاجرام واللي هو ما كانش اي حد يقدر يتخيل ان هم هيبقوا في الحكومه تاني او ان هم يفضلوا عايشين او ان هم يبقوا شويه وقضبان، بيحصل لهم كده. ده اللي حصل في الجزائر، يعني كل القيادات الاسلاميه والقيادات العسكريه حره طليقه، وحصل يعني الموضوع وصل لنوع من الاستقرار، وفي عمليه في شق من مكونات العداله الانتقاليه متحقق اللي هو جبر الضرر عمليه ناجحه الى حد ما في الجزائر، مستثمر فيها فلوس كتير جدا، طبعا الجزائر معاها فلوس الى حد ما. نفس الكلام في لبنان، يعني في الاخر بعد صراع طويل جدا ودموي جدا كل مجرمي الحرب اللبنانيين موجودين في الحكومه وهم نخبه المجتمع والناس ما كانتش متقبله فكره ان الناس دي تبقى جزء مننا، وتقبلوها في الاخر عشان الصراع طول وعنيف والناس بتزهق. فاحنا اللي نقدر نعمله ان احنا نحاول ما نطولش الصراع، عشان هتبقى كل ما الصراع بيقصر كل ما مكاسبك هتبقى، كل ما قدرت تقنع الاطراف دي ان الصراع لازم يقصر مكاسبك هتبقى اكتر على مستوى تعزيز الديمقراطيه وعلى مستوى تحقيق العداله، وان تقدر تحاسب بعض الناس على الاقل. وفي تجارب ثانيه كتير مختلفه، يعني في تجربه زي الهند الشماليه الصراع طول جدا فيها، بس على الاقل حققوا بعض الانجازات الديمقراطيه على مستوى الاصلاح المؤسسي واصلاح الشرطه ما الى ذلك. فهو ما فيش فورمولا ثابته يعني في الموضوع، والناس مش شرط تتغير، يعني هو جميل لو الناس اتغيرت بس مش شرط تتغير، الصراعات مسيرها تنتهي. عبد الغني عايز يقول حاجه، وبرضه لو حد عايز يشتبك مع الافكار دي.
عايز اقول انه يعني لا انا هختلف معاك شويه يا كريم في انه الناس طبعا الناس كده
يعني ممكن ياخد 100 سنه،
ممكن 100 سنه، ممكن 200 سنه، كمان 500 سنه هتضطر تزهق في الاخر. بس انا يعني الناس مش شرط تضطر تزهق بسرعه. انا رايي انه لا، التيار الاسلامي فلوس كتير قوي 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 مش هيزهق، والحكومه يعني دوله قويه قوي 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 مش هتزهق. الصراع هيطول شكله في مصر، احتمال كبير، لا احتمال كبير جدا يطول. فانا مش متخيل الصراحه انه هيحصل في مصر عمليه محترمه لعداله الا هتكون دايما عداله انتقاليه، لانه يعني العداله الانتقاليه دايما هي عداله انتقاليه. انا بس بتلخبط عشان الترانسليشن.
ارجع ورا احسن شويه.
العداله الانتقاليه هي طريق غير عادي للعداله، صح؟ لو في الحكومه او في الدوله ليهم نيه للسيطره هتبقى عداله انتقاليه. فانا مش متخيل الصراحه اي طريقه هينتهي بيها الصراع في مصر الا لو وصل على قمه الدوله حد مؤمن بده وعايز ده. ده كان سؤال بقى عايز اساله الى اي مدى كان العامل الشخصي انه في شخص اسمه نيلسون مانديلا مؤثر في تجربه جنوب افريقيا؟ هل يعني هل الشخص كان مؤثر؟ يعني فكره ان يعني احنا وصلنا في هذا الشخص كان يعمل مؤثر جدا. لو كان في ظرف حصل في التاريخ الشخص ده كان مات او حصل له اي حاجه ثانيه، كان جنوب افريقيا ممكن تعيش سكه.
في تعليق او سؤال كمان هنا؟ عبد الغني؟ طب هنجيلك.
بس شكرا جدا لقدومك الى القاهره وفي رحله قصيره. انا عندي سؤال خاص بالعداله الانتقاليه. انا يعني بحاول اكون واقعي بشكل كبير، بس انا عاوز اعرف ما هي اهميه العداله الانتقاليه في وضع مصر الحالي. مصر منذ 25 يناير لم ترى تغيير في النظام، لا حتى تغيير جذري ولا تغيير تدريجي ولا تغيير نوعي. بصراحة شديدة مين هم الأشخاص الفاعلين اللي ممكن يطبقوا العدالة الانتقالية في مصر إذا كنا لازلنا نرى نفس الوجوه القبيحة اللي هي بتحكم مصر منذ ثورة 52؟ الفكرة إن وجود ثورة 25 يناير هي كانت مجرد حركة ثورية طلبت بالتغيير، لكن التغيير لم يحدث. حتى في 30 يونيو الإخوان لما قامت ثورة عليهم دعمها النظام اللي هو مش راضي يسيب الحكم، ونفس النظام برضه هو اللي احنا صرنا عليه في 25 يناير، وكتير من اللي نزلوا 30 يونيو برضه صاروا عليه. نفسه هو اللي عين وزير العداله الانتقاليه. فعن اي عداله انتقاليه نتحدث في عدم وجود عداله ثوريه اصلا او في المكان الاول يعني. فانا معلش انا مش بحاول اكون محبط، بس انا بحاول استفسر ايه اهميه العداله الانتقاليه في عدم اصلا وجود عداله ثوريه. فهل النظام ممكن يحمل عداله انتقاليه لنفسه؟ ومين الاشخاص الفاعلين الذي يمكن ان يشاركوا في صناعه لجان تقصي حقائق او لجان اكتشاف حقائق واقامه مصالحه وعقد مصالحه وطنيه؟ شكرا.
احنا ثوره كاتيانا، الراجل ذنبه ايه؟ خلينا الموضوع بس.
سؤالي كانوا بيكمل على السؤالين اللي قبليه. يعني انا كان سؤالي هل الاول كنت عايزه اعرف بتاعه شايف ايه هو جزء من تجربه جنوب افريقيا اللي ممكن يتصدر عامه للدول اللي بتمر بحكم وايه اللي ممكن تصدره مصر ازاي؟ وعايزه اعرف لو حضرتك متفق مع كريم في ان احنا المفروض نستنى لما الصراع ينتهي ولا يعني هل هو ممكن يبقى سؤال، يعني عايزه اعرف راي حضرتك، وعايزه اعرف عامه برضه يعني هل هو العداله الانتقاليه لازم تبقى جايه توب داون، لازم يبقى في ناس مش بره زي ناس مانديلا او لازم تعمل الدوله، يعني في جنوب افريقيا كانت الدوله هي اللي عملت التي ار سي عامه، يعني هي كانت سبونسرد من الدوله. بس هل في حاجه احنا ممكن نعملها دلوقتي او هل في سبيل بوتtom اب للعداله الانتقاليه عامه؟
حد عايز انت عايز تسال؟ ادم انت كان عندك سؤال؟ اتفضل. ناخد اخر احنا يعني قدامنا تلت ساعه وبكملنا ساعتين، فلو حد عايز يقول حاجه يقولها دلوقتي قبل ما ادي المايك للهاوت. زي معانا شويه وقت صغيرين.
وانا يعني ما اقصدش ان انا قاعد جوه معاك كده، بس اللي عايز
ممكن نروح نقعد على القهوه.
ممكن نبقى نكمل كلام على القهوه، بس يعني انا بس لا يعني اللي عايز اقوله ان يعني احنا بنتكلم دلوقتي عن العداله الانتقاليه، بس يعني كلامك مش اي عداله خالص. واضح ان
نجيب جنبك يعني
حل في تواطؤ يرضي جميع الاطراف او مصالحه تتغاضى عن جرائم البعض. يعني مثلا لو احنا الصبح قررنا هنعمل مصالحه، هل الاخوان مثلا هيبطلوا تسيير قاتل هيفضل في نظرهم في نفس الوقت هو وجهه نظر ملايين المصريين هو بطل وحركنا من حكم الطغاة اللي هم الحراميين برضه. اللي انا عايز اقوله هل احنا احسن لنا نتغاضى عن فكره العداله الانتقاليه ونتجه كده يعني مباشره الى تواطؤ مرضي لجميع الاطراف او مصالحه نتغاضى عن كل الاطراف ونقول يعني نعيش بسلام؟ وهل هناك هل فعلا الناس برضه هتتخلى عن حاجات احنا زي ما مشروع بتقول بعض الجماعات الاسلاميه عملت مراجعات فكريه واول ما جت فرصه لتصدر النادي نشأت طلعت الافكار القديمه اللي كانت بتتصدر وطلع زي ما بعض الناس بتحاول تقول ان لا في بدا يظهر تاني على الساحه ومش عارف ايه بعد ما تصدر هل فعلا ممكن في ظل حاله بقى التوتر ونقدر نرضى بالمصالحه والتراضي بقى عن الايديولوجيات وعن جرائم الناس؟ هل ده هيبقى منتج يعني؟
في حد كمان؟ ماشي. انت وبعدين محمد وبعدين نحاول بقى ندي وقت.
هو بس انا عشان الناس اللي حصل لها حاله توتر وموضوع ان احنا وضعنا سيء جدا، هو في تجارب عمليه انتقاليه على سبيل المثال في اسبانيا علاجهم ان هم يجهدوا حتى 52,000 ضحيه. يعني في بعض الاحيان بيبقى العلاج فعلا متكتم على كده وكان مفيش حاجه حصلت. بس كان في ملاحظه عايز اقولها ان تولي الجهات الحكوميه مش بالضروره معناه تولي الجهات الحكوميه للعداله الانتقاليه مش بالضروره معناه نجاحها، بالعكس. يعني نقطه المبدا مثلا خالد شاهد ان مجرد ما الحكومه تبقى ابر هاند على العداله الانتقاليه تحط مسؤول الحكومه على الكلام ده بدايه فكره فشلها. يعني بس كانت ملاحظه ان مصر وتونس فيها وزاره العداله الانتقاليه عفوا ده اكبر دليل ان احنا فشل العداله الانتقاليه.
انا ما بقولش ان حاجه كويسه.
بس يعني يمكن في نفس الناس متخيل وجود وزير ده معناه حاجه كويسه خالص. العداله الانتقاليه زي ما انت قلت من شويه ان هي اراده سياسيه، بس انا احب اضيف ان هي حصيله تفاعل اراده سياسيه واراده شعبيه. ومصر كممل واكرر نفس المثل بتاع غانا، لان انا بعتقد اعتقاد شخصي من واقع الدراسه بتاعتي مقارنه بين المغرب وغانا، المغرب قرار سياسي صرف، العيال الملكيه هي اللي بتطور نفسها عشان هي مش قادره تكمل الصراع بالمنظر ده. اما غانا والرائع في تجربه غانا ان المجتمع مدني، جمعيات عاديه اعتياديه
نجحت ان هي تجبر النظام وتحط رؤيه وتفرض وجهه نظرها وتحققها. فاحنا مش بالضروره هنبقى قاعدين منتظرين الايد العليا للنظام الحكومي عشان يعمل الكلام ده. احنا بطريقه او باخرى لو عندنا وضوح في رؤيتنا، احنا كمان للاسف الشديد مفتقدين كمواطنين لفكره الاراده السياسيه للانتقال. يعني هو عشان يبقى عندي عداله انتقاليه في الاساس فلازم يكون عندي رغبه في الانتقال، والانتقال ده مش من فراغ، الانتقال ده في اطار ان انا بعمل حاجه اسمها تحول ديمقراطي. احنا للاسف كمواطنين نفتقد الوعي لاهميه الانتقال الديمقراطي اساسا عشان نفكر في الاسلوب اللي بعدها.
هو السؤال بتاعي ليه علاقه بالسكن. هل دايما اي عمليه عداله انتقاليه بتنجح معناها ان احنا بننتقل لنظام ديمقراطي؟ يعني احنا عندنا الجزائر مثلا مثال على ان لا، فهل ده مثال موجود كتير ولا يعني الجزائر بالنسبه لنا دي حاجه سبيشال كيس بس احنا ممكن نبقى شبهها بحكم ان احنا عندنا تيار اسلاميه مثلا؟ فده سؤالي بس، هل دايما العداله الانتقاليه مرتبطه بالتحول الديمقراطي ولا لا؟
في اي حد تاني يا جماعه عايز يعلق او يسال؟ You have a few questions. طب انا هرد بس على ادم سريعا وبعدين ادي الهاورد عشان هو عنده اسئله كتير يرد على ادم. اسف وبالمره نناقش الموضوع ده. انا اولا يعني هو طبعا احنا كنا بنتكلم على انهاء الصراع والانتقال السياسي، لو مش بالضروره يكون انتقال ديمقراطي، وممكن يعني النموذج بتاع الجزائر كان نموذج من ده، حصل انتقال سياسي ما فيهوش انتقال ديمقراطي، في نوع من انواع جبر الضرر، ما فيهوش محاسبه على اخطاء الماضي. التجربه بتاعت اسبانيا كان فيها حصل فيها انتقال ديمقراطي وكان الثمن اللي اتدفع مقابل ده هو حاجه شبه النسيان الكامل. يعني هم برضه في السنوات الاخيره بس ابتدوا يفكروا ان احنا نغير شويه تماثيل ونشيل تمثال فرانكو، حاجات يعني فضلت مستمره سنوات طويله جدا بعد سقوط النظام في 76 لو الذاكره ما خانتنيش. فهي ما فيش زي ما قلنا يعني هي في عمليه انتقال سياسي، فاحنا بنتكلم على حاجتين مختلفين او على اكثر من حاجه في الحقيقه. احنا بنتكلم على انهاء الصراع، بنتكلم على شكل التحول في الحوكمه اللي بيحصل، وبنتكلم على مسائل بقى العداله والمصالحه والاصلاح المؤسسي، وكل الحاجات دي ممكن يحصل منها امزجه مختلفه وممكن ما يحصلش اي حاجه خالص. فانا برضو ردا على اللي ادم كان بيقوله، انا ما اتكلمتش، انا بتكلم على يعني مش ده مش اللي انا بدعو له بالضروره، انا ما بدعوش للنسيان ولا بدعو للمصالحه بدون، انا ما زلت مؤمن ان احنا يمكن يبقى عندنا الفرصه لو الصراع ما طولش قوي ولو جه بديل ديمقراطي في الحكم ان احنا نحقق شكل من اشكال العداله الانتقاليه اقرب للنموذج اللي احنا نفضله، اللي هو فيه اصلاح مؤسسي وشيء من المحاسبه على جرائم الماضي ومكاشفه وما الى ذلك. لكن انا بتكلم على اللي بيحصل في حالات كتير واللي ممكن يحصل والطريق اللي احنا ماشيين فيه. انا قلت بس حاجه واحده، ان هو لما الصراع بيطول والاطراف اللي فيه بتزيد وفي اطراف اكتر بتتورط في دم وعدد الضحايا بيكبر، الموضوع بيبقى اصعب واحيانا بتجبر على انك تقدم تنازلات، وكل ما الموضوع يطول كل ما التنازلات بتزيد وصولا الى مرحله ان احنا طب خلاص احنا عايزين ما نموتش بس، فمستعدين نتنازل عن اي حاجه زي ما حصل في لبنان. فده ممكن يحصل طبعا. انا شايف ان احنا بعاد عن ده لسه، بس هو ممكن فانا كنت بقول بس ان ده نموذج لشكل من اشكال انهاء الصراع، مش بقول ان هو بالضروره النموذج اللي احنا عايزين نتبناه في مصر. بس هسيب بقى الكلام لهاول يتكلم يرد عليك الاسئله.
The first quite interesting question was the role played in South African transition by Nelson Mandela, and whether the transition could have happened without him. I suppose what would have happened if he wasn't there. That certainly is a fascinating question, and while one doesn't want to reduce a transitional process to a question of personalities, I think it's undeniable that Mr. Mandela did play a massive role in South Africa's transition. It certainly is arguable, at least, that without his guiding presence, we may not be in the place that we're at today. The role that he played in reaching out to the apartheid regime, the role that he played in bringing the members of his own organization around to the notion of a negotiated transition, I think were quite instrumental in paving the way forward in South Africa. Could somebody else have played that role? I don't know. Having said that, South Africa, at least around the late 80s and early 90s, in terms of national leadership in the liberation movement, I think we've been blessed with quite inspirational leadership. And it wasn't just Mr. Mandela who played that role. I think of others who were imprisoned with him, a man such as Walter Sisulu, and quite a few others. I think that that group of individuals, that all of them had the same kind of caliber. They may not have had the same kind of charisma as Mr. Mandela, but I think some of them were close to Mr. Mandela and certainly in his league. And I certainly think that if it wasn't Mr. Mandela, some of the others would have stepped up to the plate. I will say though that having an inspirational leader of the order of a man like Nelson Mandela obviously is so beneficial to South Africa, where you do have somebody who transcends and rises above the differences, who becomes so dear to the hearts of many, including those who hated him to begin with. I gave the example of my father, who believed him to be nothing more than a violent terrorist. But after he was released and he heard Mr. Mandela speak, he witnessed Mr. Mandela reaching out to people across the political spectrum. He saw the generosity in his heart, and he saw his humanity. My father and so many others who was, really quite hardline individuals, saw in him so much. Yes, if there was a Mandela in Egypt, if there was a Mandela in Syria and in many other countries, there's no doubt that it would be of enormous help and benefit. The next question dealt with the importance of transitional justice in Egypt at the moment, and I think it's a pretty good observation that we still have the same faces in power over so many years. Why should transitional justice work under the management of these very same faces? Is there in fact the political will to do so? Can you have serious fact-finding when these individuals are controlling things? And I think it is a good point, because if we looked at the fact-finding endeavours that have been launched so far, none of them can be regarded as particularly serious or coherent. From what I understand, the two biggest fact-finding initiatives have been largely secretive. We've yet to see their full reports. The current fact-finding endeavour is a rather closed affair. There's almost no information available. So I think that is quite an astute observation, even if it is a rather depressing one. But it also does speak to the role of civil society, that you need to be out there offering a critical voice to these initiatives and putting up those best practices and minimum standards that ought to be complied with. And if they're not, your voices really must be heard. Should we wait until the end of the conflict before engaging in transitional justice? Well, there is a principle that some experts subscribe to, and they say, yes, if you're talking about formal transitional justice, then you do have to wait until the end of conflict. Of course, the end of conflict in certain situations, and I suspect Egypt is such a situation, is a very blurry line. It's not entirely clear when that conflict is going to end, and there could be lots of debate around that particular question. Having said that, I always believe that there's still certain things that look like and feel like transitional justice, which can be taken even before the end of conflict, and that really is around truth-seeking and documentation, and ensuring that information and evidence is not lost. And organizations such as our host organization this evening and many others in Egypt are playing incredibly valuable roles by investigating, engaging in unofficial fact-finding, writing reports, preserving evidence, preserving memory, because all these steps are putting in place the building blocks and the platform for a coherent transitional justice program in the years to come. Second last question. In the interests of national reconciliation, can we neglect or ignore certain crimes in order to pursue with the goal of national reconciliation? A very controversial question, but important policy choices that a country like Egypt has to consider. You've heard in South Africa that we did go down this road somewhat. We did offer impunity under certain conditions, and indeed some very serious crimes were forgiven through that process. Some other countries have adopted a blanket amnesty approach, either in form or de facto blanket amnesty. There is an international standard that some say prevents countries from ignoring the most serious of crimes known to humanity, namely war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide. And at least when those kinds of acts rise to the level of international crimes, that all countries ought to be obliged to follow them up and pursue them, regardless of what impact they may have on national reconciliation. But at the end of the day, this is a debate that needs to happen here in Egypt, and you need to decide whether you can afford, whether it's appropriate to forgive such crimes in the interests of reconciliation. One of the questions needs to be asked: does impunity for such crimes in fact promote national reconciliation? Is there perhaps an argument that suggests that they may, in the longer term, retard or undermine reconciliation and respect for the rule of law? Finally, is transitional justice always linked to the democratic process? Karim has handled this to some extent. And the answer to this question is, well, no, it isn't. And there are quite a number of examples where transitional justice happens completely in the absence of the democratic process or democratic reforms. Personally, I would like to see transitional justice working hand in hand with democratic reforms and the building of a new society based on tolerance and human rights and democracy. But sadly, it's often not the case. And two interesting and recent examples are Sri Lanka and Thailand, both engaged in certain transitional justice mechanisms, namely reconciliation initiatives and truth-seeking. And in both countries, they were not linked to any serious democratic reforms. So we see in Sri Lanka the democratic process, in fact, taking several steps back, and the old days of repression and undemocratic rule returning. Yes, there is a democracy in the sense that they hold national elections, but dissent is not tolerated. Those in the opposition are harassed and targeted and assassinated. Newspapers are closed down. I suppose that sort of story probably sounds quite familiar to you. And in Thailand, where there also was a truth commission and talk of reforms, but not in a serious way, because they weren't looked at particularly serious. We see what's happening in the streets of Bangkok today, to see that many people are very unhappy with the reforms and the democratic process and the lack of serious constitutional revision, and they're accepting nothing less than a total overhaul. They're not even respecting the elections that took place in the last week. So no, TJ processes are not always linked to the democratic program.
تعليق أخير عشان ما نطولش على الجمهور.
I only have a final comment. I think we can end with looking at the full half of the glass of water. Karim was saying that when police, the security sector, is afraid, they can invest on this. Okay? I think now they are afraid. They are suffering from fears. They are really, they are putting bags of sand in front of every station, and they're hiding behind them. They are afraid. So at least you can count on this. You can. It's a pressure on them. You can use. You can benefit from this. So let's think how we can do this.
شكرا سعيد. طيب طبعا كلنا عارفين مين هو مانديلا الشرق الاوسط، صح؟ حد ما يعرفش؟ انا عايز
اختم بس بجمله واحده، حاجه سلسله اهم حاجه بس نطلع بيها من النقاش المجال دايما عن تجربه جنوب افريقيا، ان العفو والمصالحه ما هماش مرادفات لاحترام الجماعه اللي انت فاكرها، عشان الناس فاكره الموضوع ده مش ده اللي حصل في افريقيا. احنا يعني عشان كده انا شاكر جدا الاول ان هو اثر النقاش ان هو يدينا شويه فكره تفصيليه عن اللي حصل في جنوب افريقيا في فتره المفاوضات وشغل اللجان دي كانت عامله ازاي واللي حصل بعدها. فاحنا شاكرين جدا ليه ان هو تكرم، هو كان جاي مصر زياره وتكرم ان هو ادانا وقته ويجي ويحضر معانا النقاش ده. واشكركم جدا للحضور ولاثراء النقاش، ويا ريت كلنا نقرا الفاتحه لروح مانديلا.